And so I am Leonardo, and together with Susanna, as some of you might already know, we are working to enrich and enhance the great community of the GIOCA alumni and professors. And we are here today to, in the very first webinar, hopefully of a long series, to learn and discuss a little bit more around art leaderships and ethics. So, and we couldn't deal with such a topic without the help of James, the International Arts Management and Consultant and former professor at GIOCA from 2009 to 2013, if I'm not wrong. So before we start, I remind you all that you can use the chat anytime, that Susanna will be monitoring it. And also you can keep your webcams on and mics off unless you want to jump in the discussion. We have a flexible schedule. We thought of a 40 minutes presentation by James, followed up by a Q&A, and feel free to interact with us. And so I hope you will enjoy, and I will leave the floor to James while I share my screen.
Thanks so much, Leonardo and Susanna. I appreciate the invitation. Bologna, to me, is like a second home. I was a student in 1970 and 71 at the university and at the conservatory. I was a pianist in my first career. And my wife and I have subsequently gone back to Bologna many times, and then I was fortunate enough to teach in the GIOCA program for a number of years, for 4 or 5 years. And now I am teaching at Bocconi in Milan, in addition to the work I do as a management consultant and a search consultant. So today, we're going to talk about the ethical crises in the arts. And you notice that crises is the plural because there are many. There's a multitude of crises that the arts leader is confronting, like Me Too, Black Lives Matter, cancel culture, I would say growing authoritarianism around the world, not only in Russia and in Eastern Europe, and the balance of arts and commerce. And all of these things are putting undue pressure and more responsibility on the arts leader, more so than I've ever seen. Just on the left-hand side, you can see a group of protesters here outside the Royal Opera House, protesting that the Royal Opera House receives money from an oil company, and that how could an opera company, an opera house, representing the people, engage with a company that is, according to them, poisoning the people. On the right-hand side, and this was just last week, a group of students and art historians and others were protesting outside of a museum in Philadelphia because this museum holds the skulls and bones of a number of American slaves. And they were at one point used to study, maybe to study eugenics, which is not a good thing. And they are now protesting. I mean, these bones were there for 100 years, but somehow something is in the air that is telling us that there's a wrong that needs to be righted, and people feel empowered. And again, it's putting great pressure on the leaders of these institutions. So let's move forward. Today, we're going to talk about, what's happening in the world around us, but also what are the ethical issues that these leaders are confronting, and finally, what can arts leaders do? Some of you might be familiar with my podcast, The Search for Arts Leadership. And for those of you who are not, I'll just give you a brief. It was something I put together last summer with a former student from the Free University in Berlin, where I also taught arts management, Svenja Klukow, where I put together many of my theories about what an arts leader does, what makes a great arts institution, and what are the responsibilities of the arts leaders. And I use this acronym, SEARCH, and it stands for S for sustainability, E for ethics, A for access, R for relevance, C for creativity, and H for humanity. That is, the great arts institutions abide by these things. They're sustainable, but also they're accessible. And ultimately, the H is that great arts leaders and great arts institutions have a responsibility to change the world, to be part of the humanist ecosystem. And so today we're going to talk about the E of this search for arts leadership, the ethics. And as I introduced in the beginning, the ethical arts leader not only confronting these things, but I contend the ethical arts leader as a defender of the arts and the artist, and also I'll say later on, the definer of what arts are and what great arts is. As Leonardo said earlier, if there are any questions or any debates or any comments that you'd like to bring forward, please feel free to chat or raise your hand. I do want you to know that I am fairly even about these things. If you have a particular point of view, I'd love to hear it. But I like to consider myself as a humanist and also as an ethicist. Some of you know that between 2003 and 2018, I created and ran the Institute for Ethical Leadership at Rutgers Business School, where we confronted some of these issues of arts and ethics, and also business and ethics and leadership and ethics. So a lot of my thinking and some of the things we'll be talking about today are related to that history. We can go forward. This phrase, ripped from the headlines. You just need to open up a newspaper today to find, for example, earlier this month in La Repubblica, vietato censurare mai più film al rogo. Finally, I was surprised to read, as many of you might have been surprised, that the censor board for films in Italy finally either stopped censoring or put to rest that they will be censoring films. We were talking the other day that the Bertolucci film, Last Tango in Paris, was something that you couldn't see in Italy. There were 3 copies, as I understand it, in the censor bureau for some arcane reason. But I was surprised by the great breadth of artistic films in Italy, and yet there was still a censor board. Thankfully, it's gone. The next issue is worldwide. We can go to that now. Allegations against Placido Domingo deemed credible by the LA Opera. Everybody knows Placido Domingo, the great Spanish tenor, who also was the director, the general director of the LA Opera. He also worked for many years at the National Opera in Washington, sang at the Met, is a visitor throughout opera houses in Europe. And I think many people knew that he had a penchant for liking women and for what some women came forward to say was inappropriate conduct. The LA Opera did a thorough investigation and they decided that, yes, that's true. And he was fired. And he no longer can work really in America as an opera singer or as an opera director. I do know that he's still performing in Europe, but this idea that something in his past, something that happened years ago at the Washington Opera, now takes on a great deal of importance. And again, I'm not making a value judgment about what he did. There are certainly egregious examples of what leaders in the arts have done that really border on and are illegal, and those things should be punished to the extent of the law. This, to me, is one of those gray areas, maybe. Let's keep going forward. The next is the Smithsonian, the largest museum in America, which is really our only large government-owned museum. And he is the first African-American to be the head of the Smithsonian. And a group of staff people from one of the museums, the National Museum of African Art, felt that it was outrageous that the very Museum of African Art was being racist. And so he has done a mea culpa and is looking into those tasks. Now, at one point, the Smithsonian chief would be well beyond any criticism whatsoever. And then finally, we have this, what should museums do with the bones of enslaved? And I showed you that poster from the beginning. And this is an article, a recent article from the New York Times that says it puts into shocking relief our need to address the problem of the historical exploitation of people of color. So it's not only that these museums that this museum is housing the skulls and bones of African Americans, but this group that's protesting is calling on the museum as a representative of the historical exploitation of people of color. It's a much deeper ethical issue. And imagine if you were the director of the Harvard Museum or the Penn Museum or the Smithsonian, what you would feel, how you would deal with it, or even who would you go to for advice. So let's keep going. This is a very, very dramatic photo. Professor Love, do you recognize the place? I believe this is the Tate.
It's Tate Britain, yes.
You
Tate
know,
Britain in the Duveen galleries, yes.
Right, and this is a group of protesters protesting the extraordinary sponsorship in terms of amount of dollars that British Petroleum has been putting into the Tate and all the museums in Britain. And what they are feeling is not only exploitation, but insinuation of programmatic influence. So that it's just a dramatic graphic picture. I love this picture to get people's attention. But what I'm talking about today is this power shift that all of a sudden philanthropy that might be called toxic is being protested very lively here at the Tate. And in the New York Times this morning, a group of protesters has announced that it will, in fact, enter MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, on Friday this week to protest the fact that what they're calling oligarchs are running the museums now. The chairman of the board of MoMA is as rich as an oligarch. He runs a hedge fund that owns companies that provide mercenaries in the Middle East. He's given a lot of money to MoMA, and this group is going to go in and protest. We know about politicization by governments from Russia, now in Hungary. There are many cases at the Smithsonian and in the United States. There is a conservative movement, while there is a liberal movement, I would say, throughout the world towards the climate and other things, equality. There's also a very strong conservative movement. I will tell you that in till President Biden was elected, we in the United States, we liberal-minded people were suffering under a very, very conservative, almost dictatorial government. I mentioned Black Lives Matter, Me Too, repatriation, and censorship. So these issues and others, which we'll continue to talk about today, are issues that existed, but now the leader, the head of the Tate, the head of the Metropolitan Museum, the head of the Public Theater, the head of the Berlin Opera, etc., are now confronting in a way that they never have confronted before. And in a little while, we'll look in a little more detail about some of the case studies. I think we can move on unless there are some questions or comments. Here we go. Here are two other, not too distant issues facing, in this case, museums, but it goes across the board. On the right, we see a protester saying, "Get Rebecca Mercer out of our museum." Rebecca Mercer is an extraordinarily wealthy donor and board member of the American Museum of Natural History, but she also happens to be someone who supports anti-climate change lobbyists. So she is against climate change. And these protesters are saying, how can we have a board member who is going to hire our director, who has undue influence on the institution because of her support of the institution? How can we have her as a board member? This is a question. She is still, she left the board, but the museum director, the museum president, Helen Futter, found herself in a dilemma trying to defend this person and defend the board while this person being exposed as a client denier. And the Museum of Natural History is an institution that believes in science. And so we have this ethical dilemma. On the right-hand side, that's a picture outside of the new Whitney Museum on the west side of Manhattan. And here's a group of protesters saying Warren Kander must go. Warren Kander is a wealthy board member who contributes a great deal to the Whitney Museum of Art. He also owns a company that makes poison gas. What do you call that? Gas that they use to break up protests, right? And this gas was used to break up protests at the American-Mexican border. So here's a group of staff people and other public saying to the director and to the rest of the board, how could you have a guy like Kander on our board of directors? But Kander and Mercer give a great deal of money. So the question is, how can the arts leader fire enormously wealthy board members because of their questionable values while ensuring long-term sustainability of the enterprise? It's not enough to say, yeah, they're bad, they have to go. But I think if we looked at the rest of the board and put some kind of purity test against each of them, we would find some questionable people. There are no answers. There are no correct answers to this, right? This is what I'm talking about, some kind of ethical dilemma. But we'll see later on that I believe that there are some solutions to this. There are some ways of embracing all of these issues and somehow coming to a solution. Again, no questions, we'll move forward. Some of you may recognize the photo on the left. That's Martin Parr. Martin Parr is a world-famous photographer, has had a significant influence on photography and photographers throughout his career, and was the artistic director of the Bristol Photography Festival that was coming up. He also was a contributor of an essay to a book that was published in 1969 by another photographer. And this was the reissue of this book. And you see an unfortunate juxtaposition of two pages in this book. On the left is an African-American or a British-American woman. On the right is a caged gorilla or monkey. A young African-British student saw this, went to social media, mounted a campaign that overwhelmingly, castigated Martin Parr. So much so to the point, and remember, he wrote this essay, he said he really didn't realize the injustices of this juxtaposition. The bottom line is he resigned his position as head of the as artistic director of the Bristol Festival. The publisher retracted the book, destroyed copies of the book, and you could argue that a lifetime reputation by a great photographer and also contributor to photography and promoting photographers of color was in some ways ruined by this act. Unconscious, he claims it's a completely unconscious act. I mean, I think I'd like you to each ask yourself in these situations, what do we do? How do we figure this out? How do we understand the right and wrong of this? If I'm the publisher, if I'm Parr, if I'm the general public that's seeing this barrage of social media against him. Let's keep going. The next slide is, you might recognize Chuck Close. He's one of America's great visual artists. His works appear in museums around the world. They're highly prized, highly valuable works. And back of him is a portrait he did of Steve Reich, the composer. And a couple of years ago, a couple of his models, his female models, accused him of sexual harassment years after the fact. Remember, Close is incapacitated. He can't walk. He's confined to a wheelchair. And they made these credible or not comments about Close. And as a result, an exhibit that he had at the National Gallery was taken down. And there were concerns that his works in all the museums in the world would be removed. So the caption, please, here is, in the time of Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and other social movements, can controversial or inappropriate actions by artists ever be forgiven or excused? Must we separate the art from the artist? And this is the arts leader's moral dilemma. I'm not talking about Close. Close is the painter, but Close needs the museum director, needs the gallery director, so that his works can be seen by a wider public, needs a publisher, needs an arts leader. And so this is the question. As the arts leader, I'm not talking about Close. He did what he did. He's suffering the consequences or not. I'm talking about the director of the National Gallery, or the director of a museum that is deciding whether or not to take down his works because of what he's accused of. That, to me, is what I'm talking about, is this ethical crisis. Let's keep going. Again, if you like to give me a break to take a glass of water and ask a question, I'm happy to do it. This is a sign outside of the Smithsonian. A couple of years ago, there was a show called Hide Seek, and it's in the Portrait Gallery, and it was a series of contemporary portraits, one of which was done by a Czechoslovakian artist named Wozniak, and but some people felt that this was sacrilegious, had some religious imagery and some fairly difficult imagery, right? And the Smithsonian director of this museum at the time first took this work because of the protests and put it in the back of the exhibit. But then his boss, the head of the Smithsonian, demanded that that work be taken out of the exhibit. Other artists in the exhibit protested. They wanted their works removed, but they didn't have the right to remove their works. And that year at the Institute at Rutgers, along with another university museum ethics program, we did a day-long conference on this very subject. And we invited the director of this museum who removed the work, and we invited critics and artists, and we had a day-long symposium. And I had a chance to ask the director during the Q&A why he took the work out of the exhibit. And he said, well, my boss told me to do it. And I said, yeah, but why did you do it? Where is your allegiance? And he said, what, and this was his quote, what, did you want me to fall on my sword? In other words, what, did you want me to get fired? This is the question. How important is it? Where do we make the moral, ethical judgment? You know, the postscript to this story is I saw this exhibit at the Brooklyn Museum with the Wozniak picture in it. It wasn't offensive to me. And I've seen much more offensive things, you know, on Saturday morning cartoons and certainly in the cinema. So that's an example. Let's take another one. A little more contemporary. Philip Guston is an American artist. He was about to have a major show that was going to travel to the Tate and to the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston and to the Boston Museum and to the National Gallery. I mean, these are the premier museums in the world. And this was a premiere, a retrospective of his work. And some of his work has images that could be interpreted as the Ku Klux Klan. In fact, they are images of the Ku Klux Klan. And I want to get my notes here because according, and what happened was the directors of these museums, maybe with some pressure from their boards, I don't know, but they decided to delay the opening of this long-awaited retrospective until 2024 because, quote, when its message of social and racial justice can be more clearly interpreted. Many critics in the world, in the art world, call the postponement cowardly, patronizing, and wrong. What do you all think? I don't know. This is the all of these questions are the ethical questions, right? The final one is, to me, the most egregious. During the time of terrorist actions by Arab Muslim terrorists in Europe, during the time of Charlie Hebdo, during the time when that cartoon in a Danish newspaper caused a great deal of unrest and fear, the Victoria and Albert Museum quietly removed this image of Mohammed from its website. It didn't remove the image from its collection. It didn't remove the piece from its collection, but it removed the image from its website. Falsely claiming to not own a work depicting the Prophet Muhammad. Scholars of Islamic art fear terrible loss for shared global heritage. I mean, so here is an institution that's self-censoring itself for fear of religious, for fear of inciting some kind of religious backlash. I mean, to me, old white guy who loves art, I have a hard time seeing how this image, how I am prevented from seeing this image. And of course, I'm sure it's not going to be shown at the Victoria and Albert. The question, how can the arts leader remain ethical and unself-conscious in protecting art, which belongs to all of us, while taking into account matters of safety and politicization by government and religious groups? To me, complex questions. So let's pause there for a moment. And I want to make sure, as some of my students who are on the line know, I like a dialogue better than a monologue. But in the case of this webinar, perhaps I'll just keep going. But I just want to make sure that I'm not losing you. I'm covering things that are of interest to you. And then we can take a closer look at the role of the arts leader. Because remember, going back to the search for arts leadership, what we're talking about here, and for you budding arts leaders, for you arts leaders and professors on this webinar, for others who will see this in the future, these are questions that confront arts leaders particularly, because it's the arts leader who really has to ultimately make these decisions.
James, may I make a comment, please?
Of
James?
course, sure.
Give you a break to have your glass of water. If when I teach my students about ethical matters, we talk a lot about BP, we talk about Sackler, we talk about Claw, we talk about all of the large organisations that give money to the arts in the UK.
Yeah.
And I say to them, if you had to draw a line and say, beneath that line, I will not go for money, what would be under the line? And they say, after a while, they say drugs or, any kind of warfare. And then they go down and say maybe cigarette smoking, maybe, and then it goes down and down.
Right.
And very often out of that discussion, we decide that in fact, there is very little money that you might happily be able to call clean money. I mean, not just in the arts, but let's just take the example of the arts. But what I really would like to say is that when you mentioned BP, you did, I think, say something about their role in programming as well. And as I worked in tape for all those years, and we had to work with BP because BP were putting money, especially into the education program. I can tell you that they had no sway over the actual programming, but in many years that I've kind of gone backwards and forwards from Italy to the UK and seen the good things that sponsorship money brings to museums in the UK. And I mean, programs for refugees, programs for looked after children, programs for dementia sufferers, programs for Alzheimer's sufferers, a whole range of programs that we would not have had the money for, but we do have the money for because large companies like the ones I mentioned, and at the moment, neither BP nor Sackler are allowed to give money, but they are giving money specifically for marginalized audiences. So I would add to your question a further question, which is, does that clean the money up? You know, if you are taking money from organizations, and really, let's face it, you know, if it's a bank, it's going to have connections with all sorts of other arms deals or whatever else. If you take money and with that money, you then produce a wonderful series of programs that encourage people into the arts, that is totally diverse in its approach and multi-operational on every level, is that somehow making the money clean?
No, this is a very good question. This is, in some ways, the crux of the issue. And we'll learn later on, we'll see later on, my suggestion that let's stay with the arts for now, that this ultimately is a question that the arts leader must confront, fall on his sword or not, or defend. And I think the arts leader is undefended, not defended, doesn't have the tools to make a logical, sweeping, universal decision about that. And I'm suggesting that there could be a way to protect the arts leader and to protect the arts. I served for many years on the board of the Alvin Ailey Dance Company, and once at a board meeting, the director, the president, said, you know, we just got money from Bacardi, the rum company, a great sponsorship. And I said, you know, I think that that's great, but where do we draw the line? Should we draw the line? Should we have some kind of statement from the board, philosophical statement from the board that helps you, the president, out to say, yes, I can take money from that, or no, I can't take money from that. Some kind of, what we'll see later, some kind of code. So Sylvia, thank you for that thoughtful question. And as with everything dealing with ethics, it's never black and white. So let's keep going.
May I ask a question?
Yeah.
It's thank you so much for this topic. Just to reassure you, you're not losing the audience. I feel both intrigued and triggered, you know, by the topic because it's so painful. My question is, but by considering the eligibility or the cleanliness of sponsorship, we always think only about the companies. But for example, there are many countries in the world which museums are totally state funded, but maybe this museum does not support the current state. Should they somehow drop the funds? What are their options if there are no other options, right?
Right.
And also, where is the line between museum removing image because they think it's offensive to certain groups and censorship?
Exactly. And this is, you know, today we're not going to come up with the answer, but this is another point. That is, when a state museum, or when a museum that is funded largely by the state, and certainly in Eastern Europe, there are examples of that, and certainly in Russia, and up until, you know, 20 years ago, most of Europe. If you don't believe in the state and the ethics of the state, do you accept that money? This is, and that's the balance between ethics and sustainability. Because if you don't have the money, you're no longer a museum, right? So this is the added ethical challenge of the arts leader. If you're independent, If you own the museum, if you're a private company and you feel like doing it, you can do it. But museums are all part of us. We all own those museums. We all own those pictures. We all own the Royal Opera House in London. You know, we all own them. They're ours. They're our patrimony. So that's the question. So let's jump ahead and we'll have time to chat more about this. And these are 3 case studies specifically about what I'm calling arts leaders. Some of them have occurred before most of you were born. This one occurred before I was born. And that is in the late 1918 to 20. James Joyce, the famous and great Irish writer, wrote Ulysses. Ulysses now is a classic book. But in 1918, when it was serialized and published by Shakespeare and Company, which was a company in Paris at the time that published American and English-speaking works, you couldn't get a copy of it in the United States. It was banned in the United States. Imagine a work by James Joyce being banned. What happened was that Bennett Cerf, you see on the left, Bennett Cerf, was a young American publisher. And to me, a publisher of art, and in this case, literature, is the same as the director of the Royal Opera House, is the same as the general director of the Berlin Theater Company. It is the person that makes a decision about what art gets to the public and is the person that makes the decision to promote that art and to bring it to the public. So remember, if you were in America, you could not read Ulysses. Bennett Cerf, young, not a lot of money, went to Paris, met with James Joyce, who was living in Paris at the time, and said, I will publish your work in the United States. I will try to get it published if you give me the rights to publish it. And of course, if Bennett Cerf and Random House gets the rights to publish it, then they will get royalties. That's how it works. James Joyce gave him the permission. Bennett Cerf went to one of the most famous lawyers in America and said, I can't afford to pay you, but if you take this case on, this case which I'm going to cause, then I'll give you part of the royalties. So to me, this is Bennett Cerf saying, I'm going to stake my life, my reputation, maybe not my life, but my reputation and my financial fortune and my publishing company on doing what he then did, which is he asked Joyce to send him the book. He told the authorities confiscated the book. They accused him of bringing in something that was contraband. There was a lawsuit, and Bennett Cerf and Random House won the lawsuit. And therefore, they could publish the book in the United States. And I would argue that because Ulysses was then published in the United States, and then able to be read by many, many people, that he, Joyce, influenced American literature for a generation. And Bennett Cerf made money, of course, but without Bennett Cerf and without him being able to stand up to the authorities in what I would consider an ethical issue, censorship, he was able to get Ulysses published. And of course, the whole idea of what pornography was changed. But it wasn't changed forever, as we'll see in this next photo, in this next slide. And this is Dennis Barrie on the far left, who was at the time the director of the Cincinnati Museum of Contemporary Art, and Robert Mapplethorpe, Retrospective. Mapplethorpe an American photographer, a gay American photographer who ultimately died of AIDS, whose photographs are now worth, hundreds of thousands of dollars. He was unknown at the time, but some of them were what we would consider today to be mildly pornographic or difficult images. But you could see the folks in Cincinnati, for pornography, not art. Get him out of here. Art by any other name, porn, smells the same. You see these protesters. The exhibit didn't even open. And the city of Cincinnati, a conservative city, traditionally, was up in arms. And in fact, Barrie was going to be arrested if he put that exhibit up, personally arrested. And in fact, he was arrested. And because he put the exhibit up, he went to court and he was not convicted. He was acquitted of this. So to me, we have a director, a leader, who by his own convictions, but there's another part of it, because the leader, Barrie, needed to know, to judge, that this wasn't pornography, that this was in fact art, that it's the leader who makes the decisions about whether or not it's art, and then defends those decisions. Let's go to the third one. Daniel Barrenboim and Richard Wagner in Israel. That's Richard Wagner on the left, not Daniel Barrenboim. Daniel Barrenboim, many of you know, in Italy, he was the head of La Scala. He's been the head of the Deutsche Staatsopera for many years. He's performed all over the world as a great pianist and a great conductor. And he is a fan of Wagner. Now, Wagner died before Hitler was born, but Wagner was an anti-Semite. There's no question about it in his writing. We know that. The Nazis and Hitler loved Wagner's music. They thought his music and his operas defined the Third Reich. And by 1940, although the State of Israel in 1936, their orchestra was playing Wagner, by 1940, and then Kristallnacht, and then the terrible, understanding of what happened in the Holocaust, they banned Wagner from being performed in Israel. Imagine banning a composer from performing in a country. So it was up to, it could have been up to others, but it was up to Barrenboim, who himself is a Jew, who took it on himself to create the Divan East-West Orchestra, made up of Israelis and Arabs, who himself, along with a Middle Eastern wealthy person, created the Said Barrenboim Academy in Berlin to train Palestinians in Berlin. The irony of it isn't lost on me, in classical music and art. It was Barrenboim who decided, because he had the power, because he is an arts leader, and maybe because he was Jewish also, to program Wagner at a concert in which he conducted with the Israeli Philharmonic. Now, apparently, when he did do that, half of the audience stormed out in protest, half of the audience applauded, but Wagner's music was then heard in Israel. So these are three examples, and there are many, many examples of the arts leader. So I'm saying a defender of the arts, the ethical arts leader, raising the consciousness of the public by offering the avant-garde critical support, opportunities for exposure, and patronage in the face of social hostility. Certainly that's the case for Mapplethorpe. That was the case for James Joyce, believe it or not. It was the case for it was the case for Wagner. It wasn't the case for Chuck Close. It wasn't the case for Philip Dustin. It wasn't the case for the image of Muhammad in the Victorian Albert. But I'm saying that the ethical arts leader has one other responsibility, because he or she is the person ultimately responsible for judging that it is art. Think about that for a second. You know, critics, of course, are part of that ecosystem, but it is the museum director, it is the concert hall producer, it is the theater managing director or intendant who decides that this play is art and this play must be seen. That the arts institution she leads is an important arts institution for the arts and artists, and in the absence of a code of ethics, and here I introduce this idea of a code of ethics, must determine what is ethical and act accordingly. Right? I don't know if you thought of that or if you agree with it, but I'm saying that the arts leader is the person ultimately responsible for judging that it is art. How many of you have gone to a museum, Sylvia, and looked at a Jackson Pollock and heard someone say, "Oh, I could do that"? Yeah. Well, first of all, you couldn't do that. But secondly, some person happened to be at the Museum of Modern Art, and one of the Guggenheim ladies decided that what Jackson Pollock was doing was art, and did a show of his work, and Jackson Pollock's work is now art. So the arts leader is the person that decides, that defends, sometimes at the cost of his own freedom. But I'm saying at the same time that the arts leader is at sea, because there isn't a code of ethics. Let's keep going. This is Oscar Eustis, who is the head of the Public Theater in New York City, one of the most famous theaters. Joseph Papp started it. It not only produced a chorus line, but it was the place where Hamilton started, and where thousands and thousands of other great theater works were born, and dance works and others. And there was a time not too long ago when an artist named Daisy, last name Daisy, did a monologue, and the critics severely criticized him because what he was doing was basically lying about a person on stage. And Eustis came out and said, and it was this quote, maybe more than any other thing, that led me down this path. He said, "I can't say to an artist, you are a fantastic performer. And by the way, you should develop your own code of ethics, and you should hold yourself to it. The theater doesn't have a code of ethics. Doctors have a code of ethics. Lawyers have a code of ethics. Real estate agents have a code of ethics. Every profession has a code of ethics." And Oscar Eustis, who's maybe one of the great leaders in the arts in America and arguably in the world, said it. Theater doesn't have a code of ethics. How can we expect performing arts leaders and artists to abide by a code of ethics if we do not have one? Go to the next slide. Some of you know that the Art Museum Directors, the Association of Art Museum Directors, has a kind of a code of ethics and they enumerate them, like repatriation of Native American sacred objects, ensuring the provenance of a work. the professionals, the directors of the museums that belong to this association are the ones that tell us that that work by Egon Schiele or Picasso is actually a Picasso that we're looking at, that we're not looking at a fake. That's their code of ethics to ensure that. Of course, returning Nazi-looted art, protecting artists from censorship. This one selling of a museum's collection is kind of interesting because that was part of their code until 2 years ago. And because of COVID, they lifted that part of the code, which has divided the museum world pretty much in half. So, and many of you know ICOM, which is the International Committee of Museums. And ICOM has a kind of code of ethics also. But I guarantee you what it does not cover are the questions that are on the minds of Glenn Lowry at the Museum of Modern Art, and Mr. Bradburn at the Brera at the Pinacoteca Brera in Milan, or the person at the Uffizi, or the person at the Tate. And that is, what do we do with all of these other ethical issues that I have been raising today? How do I understand it? If I had a code, if I could turn to that code, I would then have some guidance. Let's keep going. We're almost there. Those of you who are hanging in there, we're almost there. So this is something that I wrote, and one of my students, when she heard that I was putting this together, and when she was nice enough to put together some of these graphics, she reminded me that I wrote this. The terrorist actions in Paris, you remember the Charlie Hebdo, beyond the tragedy and horror, should be another warning sign to the arts leaders, whether it is the prohibition of Wagner in Israel, the threats in Berlin on a Muslim interpretation of a Mozart opera, or the sensation exhibit at the Brooklyn Museum. Religious fundamentalism, censorship, and squeamishness over difficult subjects will continue to challenge the freedom of the arts. The arts must continue to be ethical, but unself-conscious, and maintain the highest professional standards, unaffected by small minds of terrorists. And who is to protect the most precious and ephemeral, if not the arts leader? This was some editorial I wrote a while back, I think after Charlie Hebdo. We have 2 slides left, I think. So the solution, big words, this is really not the solution, but I hope there will be a solution. What I'm proposing is that there should be an ethical code for the arts, a set of criteria for the profession. What is the code? What does it include? It includes things that we all believe in. What does it contain? It contains a kind of a roadmap for the arts leader. And finally, who is responsible for creating, changing, and controlling it? Not me, not an arts management consultant, not a professor, not a government, God forbid, not a corporation, but rather each of the professionals who make up the profession, the way lawyers do it, the way accountants do it, should get together and create this code of ethics. And it will change over time, and it will morph, and it will address issues that we don't even know about today. But at least there will be a code. I just put some nice pictures here. You all recognize La Scala and the Pinacoteca Brera. So another thing that influenced me years ago was an article in the Harvard Business Review by 2 professors who argued, let's make management a profession. They said, ironically, that business management is not a profession because, among other things, it doesn't have a code of ethics, right? There is no code of ethics for business. Think about it. There isn't a professional association of business people. There isn't a place where business people can say, look, you've broken the code of ethics, I'm reporting you. Lawyers could do that. Business people have no place. So what a code of ethics says, in a way, is that true professions, and I'm saying arts leaders is a profession, have codes of conduct or ethics. Through these codes, professional institutions forge an implicit social contract with other members of society. And this is the contract. Trust us to control and exercise jurisdiction over this important occupational category. Let us decide. In return, the profession promises we will ensure that our members are worthy of your trust, that they will not only be competent to perform the tasks they have been entrusted with, but they will conduct themselves with high standards and integrity. And on those words from Harvard Business Review of 20 years ago, I end this webinar and ask for comments, questions,